Thrawn Alliances is the sequel to Timothy Zahn's previous book, Thrawn, and is set between seasons 3 and 4 of the Rebels TV show. It tells two stories simultaneously. One is in the present and features Thrawn and Vader in search of a disturbance in the Force the Emperor has sensed at the edges of the unknown regions, and the other is set at the end of the Clone Wars after Ahsoka left the Jedi Order and tells the story of how Thrawn and Anakin Skywalker worked together, a story teased in the previous book but never explored. I liked the story. Generally the chapters alternate between the past and the present and follow the adventures of Thrawn and Anakin and Thrawn and Vader respectively. I thought it was quite a good format to have because it manages to tell the story teased in Thrawn, something I've really been looking forward to, while at the same time showing us the humiliation Thrawn suffered after his failure to defeat the Rebels at Atollon at the end of Season 3 of Rebels. The downside of this format is authors can never help themselves with creating too many parallels, and in the case of Alliances, Zahn has fallen into that trap. I think at least a third of the book goes like this. In one chapter, Vader and Thrawn walk into a bar, see some shifty people, then talk to the bartender. In the next chapter, Anakin and Thrawn walk into a bar, see some shifty people, and then talk to the bartender. In the next chapter, Vader and Thrawn fight the shifty people. In the next chapter, Anakin and Thrawn fight the shifty people. It's even the same fucking bar and the same fucking bartender, and the repetitiveness of it just for the sake of having mirrored stories can get a bit boring. Fortunately, this doesn't last for the entire book, as the two timelines diverge from each other about halfway through, then the book opens up from there. Thrawn is, for the most part, the same as he's always been in all the books. A tactical genius, a strong leader, someone the Emperor trusts. There's not really anything new here for Thrawn because we all know who he is, who his character is, what he's capable of, and what his personality is like. We do find out a bit more about Thrawn later in the book, but in terms of his character, he's the same as always. I loved the way Zahn wrote Vader. I didn't really like Lords of the Sith, and I'm about to read Tarkin, so I haven't really read much about Vader in the new canon, certainly not any that I really liked. But in Alliances I could hear James Earl Jones's voice when I was reading the Vader parts, and I could hear the pauses and exaggerations and the lilt of his voice just like I was watching the original trilogy. He's written as a very aggressive character, even when all he does is speak, and that's the way he should be. I also think Zahn did well with Vader's attitude. He constantly seemed like a coiled viper, waiting to strike down anyone who betrayed him or the Emperor, and he seemed to be so tense, with his hand constantly edging towards his lightsaber. From the way Zahn wrote Vader, I could just tell he was itching to use his lightsaber, and it felt like the original trilogy because you never knew when he was going to lose his shit and kill someone, but you knew it was potentially only moments away, so I think Zahn did an excellent job. I also like the fact that Zahn tried to keep Anakin and Vader as separate entities. Something I hated about the prequel trilogy was the way George Lucas humanised Vader, and the fact is, in the original trilogy, Vader was such a good bad guy and such a good character in his own right, that by humanising him, all Lucas achieved was weakening Vader's position as the best bad guy ever. I liked that when Vader was thinking about his time as Anakin, he thought of himself as the Jedi rather than as the person he was before he became Vader. By not even using the name Anakin Skywalker, it created a distance between the two characters, and I think that's the way it should be, and by calling his old self the Jedi, it matches up with Rebels when Ahsoka touched his mind and he said, "So the apprentice lives." In both instances he refused to use their names because he doesn't identify with them anymore. The way he talks about his old life is both detached and matches up with the way he talks about it in Rebels, so I think Zahn has done really well there. That's the way I like my Vader to be. All evil, no emo. I really enjoyed reading the relationship between Thrawn and Vader. I find that too often Thrawn is put on a pedestal and is almost always unbeatable because of his tactical genius, but in Alliances Zahn had no problem letting Vader put Thrawn in his place and make him his bitch. The amount of subtle and not so subtle threats Vader makes to Thrawn, not to mention the fact that he's physically imposing and strong in the Force, all managed to turn Thrawn into something close to a whimpering child, and reminded me of Moff Jerjerrod at the beginning of Return of the Jedi. To be fair to Thrawn, he held himself together quite well, but it was nice to see Vader dominate for once in the expanded universe, and equally nice to see Thrawn on the back foot. That's not to say Thrawn is completely subservient to Vader. Far from it. Thrawn seems to enjoy pushing Vader so close to the edge of losing control, and where Vader uses intimidation through physical threats and the threat of Thrawn losing his command and the favour of the Emperor, Thrawn seemingly plays his own mind games with Vader by constantly pushing his buttons, by bringing up parallels and memories Vader has of his time as Anakin Skywalker in a way that's so clear and yet at the same time so vague. For most of the book, it's not clear whether Thrawn himself actually knows Vader's secret identity, but it's close enough for Vader to worry. It's one big power struggle between the pair of them, each using their own tactics to undermine the other, and it was very enjoyable to read. I found Anakin's character to be much more based on the Clone Wars cartoon than the prequels. I know they're similar, but they're not the same. I thought in the Clone Wars he was arrogant beyond belief, and while he's similar to his movie counterpart, movie Anakin was always able to stop and think. Even when he rushed into things because of his confidence, when Obi-Wan told him something, he would listen, he would do it begrudgingly, but he would still listen. In the Clone Wars, he always had the attitude of, this is how the situation is because that's what I said and there will be no arguing. And it's the version of Anakin we'll get in Alliances. In fact, most of the time Thrawn and Anakin spend together, Thrawn says something and Anakin completely ignores him until it's too late, because he's either convinced himself that that's what the situation is and thinks Thrawn is just stupid, or he just doesn't want to listen to other people. Also, Padme was in it. She didn't do much, but it's a Clone Wars story with Anakin, so she had to be there somewhere. She didn't really do much except get shot down, then captured. But hey, that's Padme all over. That's standard Padme fare. I really could have done without her, to be honest, but at least she didn't detract from the book. She was just there, like a table. Something I noticed when rereading the Thrawn trilogy was the amount of fan service Zahn included. In Heir to the Empire in particular, it felt like every word that came out of Han's mouth was a line taken straight from the movies. Zahn is nowhere near as bad as that anymore, but there are still a few moments like that in Alliances. The one that stood out the most to me was when Thrawn asks Anakin if he's familiar with a reek. There was a page and a half of him asking, then Anakin thinking about Geonosis, then confirming he's very familiar with them, and all of this was just so Thrawn could get Anakin to stand on the bonnet, that's a hood for you Americans, of a speeder and stick his lightsaber out. I get it, but it would have been quicker if he just told Anakin, stand on the front and hold your lightsaber out. And it felt like it was included because of fan service rather than being a good addition to the book. It wasn't a big issue by any means, but it did stick out to me, and not in the best way. I particularly liked the way Vader navigated through hyperspace using the Force. When I read that bit, it took me back to when I was a kid and was reading the Jedi Academy trilogy for the first time, because that's how Luke escaped the Maw installation. I liked the lore and world building Zahn included in both Thrawn and Thrawn Alliances. With the introduction of Thrawn in Rebels, the existence of the Chiss had been established, but with the Thrawn novel, it established the existence of the Chiss Ascendancy, and with Thrawn Alliances, there's a bit more detail about exactly who they are, what their motives are, what they're capable of, and potentially the state of the Ascendancy itself. It's still a case of Disney drip-feeding the fans with lore, but at least it's the kind of lore I want to see in the new expanded universe. Cortosis is canon again, and I'm glad it's back. I've never been keen on the idea that barely anyone can take down a Jedi, so the inclusion of it in the new canon is a welcome one. I can't remember which book it was, but I'm sure it was a Bantamira book. But it was mentioned that Mandalorian armour could stop a lightsaber blade. I find that quite interesting because so far in the new canon, all Disney have managed to come up with to counter lightsabers is those electro staff things that General Grievous's guards had, and the Darksaber, which, let's face it, is just another lightsaber. Hopefully now, when they eventually retell the war between the Mandalorians and the Jedi, we'll see some real fighting and the Mandalorians will be a real challenge for the Jedi. Then there's the new enemies, the Grisk. I won't talk too much about them for anyone reading this review who hasn't read the book yet, but they seem to be similar, but still different, to the Yuuzhan Vong. I'm slightly confused about them because on the one hand they seem dangerous, but on the other hand they do have a ridiculous weakness, something only Thrawn could have figured out, and that weakness made them seem kind of dumb, so I'm not quite sure how to take them. Either way, I feel like they're an excellent example of lore that's being drip-fed by Disney. I hope we see them again because they seem to be a legitimate reason for Thrawn to have come to the known galaxy to find allies to help defend the Chiss Ascendancy and the known galaxy. But it's Disney, so I'm not counting on it because they like things isolated. I've said this in quite a few reviews now, but each book released generally seems to be isolated and doesn't really affect any of the other stories and definitely doesn't have any consequences. If you haven't read Inferno Squad, it makes no difference when you read any other book that's been released in the Disney canon, and the same applies for every other book too. Sure, some add background and may give you a new perspective like Rebel Rising did for Rogue One, or like From a Certain Point of View did for A New Hope. But that's not really creating lore with consequences, it's just embellishing what's already there. Since Bloodline was released, a lot more lore has been referenced in other books, like Tonneray Wine, which is a good thing, but it's not enough lore and consequences to weave a proper web of lore like in the old expanded universe, which is why it's always Tonneray Wine that's referenced. With the existence of the Chiss Ascendancy and the Grisk in the unknown regions, Zahn has created a threat. There may be a war with the Chiss at some point, or maybe there won't be, but at least the possibility is there now, and it's something these new Disney books have been sorely missing for 4 years. We know the Eclipse left Jakku to navigate the unknown regions, and who's to say they didn't come across the Chiss Ascendancy on that journey? It's possible that in the time between Empire's End and The Force Awakens, the First Order could have had a war with the Chiss. Perhaps the Eclipse came across them on their way to find Snoke, and the Chiss warned them off. Then once they found Snoke and became the First Order, a war could have started. Perhaps there was a 3-way war with the Imperial Remnant, the Chiss Ascendancy and the Grisk. Perhaps in the time between the Rebels finale and the Eclipse leaving Jakku, Thrawn and Ezra have made their way to the unknown regions. Maybe they team up with Eli Vanto, and perhaps that's the reason Thrawn sent him there in the first place. Perhaps after hearing Thrawn's reasons, Ezra's chosen to fight for the Chiss and managed to train certain people that were revealed in alliances to be Force sensitive, and it could be a full-out war like the new Jedi Order was. After all, by the end of Rebels, Ezra had all the knowledge he needed. He had the right attitude, understanding of the Force, and the ability to build a lightsaber. It's something I'd like to see happen. It doesn't have to happen exactly like that, but I'd like to see something similar happen. Something where one book directly affects the other book and you need to have read the previous book to understand the characters and situation. There could be an entire trilogy of books based around that storyline alone, and it's only been made possible because of Zahn's world building and the inclusion of the Chiss Ascendancy and the Grisk, and this is exactly what I mean when I say the books should have more consequences, and I'm pleased Zahn was allowed to do it, because it's a piece of lore that can directly affect other books, and could even affect the movies themselves. As long as it's not that movie trilogy that hack Rian Johnson is doing, because, you know, Rian Johnson... No. I think Disney have been wary of allowing authors to do trilogies after that complete fucking troll wrote that shitty Aftermath trilogy, but I think they should have faith in their popular writers. No one knows the Chiss better than Zahn, obviously, so there's no reason he couldn't do it. Or maybe something like Fate of the Jedi, where each book has a different author, and if they do more than 3 they could just repeat the order of the authors. However they do it, there's so much potential there now that Zahn has opened the gates to what's in the unknown regions, and as a Star Wars fan, particularly of the books, I would hate to see that potential wasted because of Disney and a pair of idiots like Dave Filoni and Pablo Hidalgo, 2 of the most unqualified people to be in charge of the direction of the Star Wars franchise and to keep its lore. I've made it clear in many of my reviews that I've never been a fan of mixing the prequels with the original trilogy. Perhaps it's because when George came along and did the prequels, he basically shat all over the expanded universe. Then it became a matter of retconning this and that and trying to make the books fit in with the movies, whereas with the new canon, it's all been mapped out beforehand, so no retcons are needed unless Pablo Hidalgo doesn't do his job, which he doesn't do regularly. I don't know what the reason is, but I have to say that with Alliances, Timothy Zahn has done a really good job of mixing the prequel era with the original trilogy, so much so that I'm actually starting to warm up to the idea in general. As a side note, with the Clone Wars coming back for the last season, even though it's completely unnecessary because we already know what happened thanks to the Ahsoka novel Dark Disciple and Son of Dathomir, perhaps we'll see a younger Thrawn after the events of Alliances, or the Grisk, or both make an appearance, or maybe Alliances will be referenced. Personally, I think bringing the series back is pointless, but that's what happens when Filoni and Hidalgo team up. So overall I thought Thrawn Alliances was a good book in the new canon. The characters stay true to how they should be, especially Vader. Bridging the gap between the prequel trilogy and original trilogy has been done well, and that's coming from someone who's never liked the idea, and the amount of lore and the gates that have been opened for future books, comics and movies is exactly what I wanted to see happen with the new expanded universe. Now it's up to Disney to make sure all their books have this kind of lore and consequences, and I hope for the sake of Star Wars that they really push it, really start forming a true expanded universe, and really just give the fans what they've been clamouring after for 4 years now. They have the opportunity, they have the ability, and they have the right authors. I just hope they don't waste it.